Brushy Mountain State Pen first opened its wooden doors in 1896, built by the hands of the original 210 inmates. Replaced with stone by prisoner labor in 1934, Brushy was Tennessee's only maximum security prison for 113 years, housing the state's most hardened criminals. Serving an average 200-year prison term in the early days, the worst of the worst walked through these doors knowing one thing: they would never be walking out. This stone-cold fortress bears witness to notorious crimes and more than a few nightmarish deaths of some 278,225 tortured souls who entered its steel gates. Welcome to Brushy. You've reached the end of the line. During the course of Brushy Mountain State Prison's illustrious 113-year history, the rooms along the main entrance hallway had various uses, depending on the needs of the prison at the time. Generally, these spaces often housed the offices of the warden, administrative staff, and various other prison employees. The loud clang of the first gate closing could be heard in nearby Petros. And more often than not, it signified the last breath of freedom that a new Brushy inmate was ever going to take. After surrendering personal belongings, inmates were given an ID number and standard-issue prison jumpsuit. As visitors entered the prison grounds, their names were recorded in the visitor log, and they were searched for possible contraband. Only one of 3 trapdoor gates were allowed to open at any given time, to help ensure the safety of prison staff and visitors. A critical security site inside the prison, the count room tracked the movements of all prisoners going in and out, whether arriving at the end of the line for the first time, heading to the hospital for medical care, transitioning to another prison, or traveling to and from the courthouse in an armed car. Prison guards kept tabs on each inmate. A small holding cell was installed to temporarily contain female prisoners who were either en route to a courthouse appearance elsewhere in Tennessee or transferring to the women's state prison. Typically arriving from county jail in the early morning, women were only held at Brushy until they boarded the daily chain bus and never permitted to stay overnight. Donald Kaler was one of 6 infamous inmates who jumped the wall with James Earl Ray in a notorious escape attempt in 1977. Amazingly, he wasn't the only Kaler determined to bust out of Brushy. Donald's brother Frankie devised his own clever escape plot, and it almost succeeded. Donning an officer's uniform that he had scoured from the laundry, Kaler managed to shimmy his 130-pound, 5 feet 6 inches frame past the first trapdoor gate and through the small commissary window. Patiently waiting an hour for the next guard shift change, he slipped on a pair of shades and pretended to read the newspaper while quietly filing out with a group of guards. Kaler managed to make it outside the max security gate before a guard recognized him. He was rewarded for his effort with a stint in the hole and extra time in the slammer. While Brushy was notorious for its dangerous housing and labor conditions, one of the most notable and unfortunate facts of prison life was the manner in which guards doled out disciplinary action. Whippings were commonplace and carried out using a 4-foot leather strap attached to a baseball bat handle. Prisoners were beaten until welts appeared, then again and again until those blisters were broken. Screams were routinely heard by the townsfolk of nearby Petros, and countless prisoners slept on their stomachs until the wounds healed. Whippings were officially outlawed at Brushy in 1965, when the warden declared the act to be inhumane. A 1928 federal government report on the nation's prisons reprimanded Brushy for its treatment of prisoners mining coal. While they were afforded showers in a 60-stall bathhouse, they were never provided towels. The government felt this was cruel, particularly for miners who were constantly covered in dirt and coal. Even without towels, it was no small task cleaning hundreds of uniforms from 2 12-plus-hour coal mining shifts. Several 250-pound capacity industrial-sized washers and dryers cleaned jeans, shirts, and whites separately. Other machines were used to press and stitch worn clothes, and each were operated by inmates, making 17 cents an hour. One prisoner even managed to devise a clever coding system to identify inmate clothing, facilitating its return to each individual. For roughly 70 years, countless prisoners marked time in the hole by scratching tally marks on the wall. With no heat or air conditioning, little ventilation, and hardly any light, release couldn't come fast enough even for the toughest convicts. In fact, it was so dark inside, prisoners would lose their vision within days. Upon release, a fellow inmate would be assigned as a guide until their sight returned, usually within a week's time. The extreme physical, mental, and emotional effects of solitary confinement in such dire conditions reportedly weighed heavily on Warden Joe Freitag. In fact, it was said Warden Freitag would visit prisoners in the middle of the night to check on their well-being, though not nearly soon enough for many a suffering man. The old hole was finally shut down in the 1960s. When Brushy opened in 1896, the hole housed disobedient and dangerous inmates for days, weeks, even months at a time if the warden deemed it right. The hole wasn't just about solitary confinement to a 6 by 3 by 8 foot space. It was far worse. Inhabitants were once treated to suspension torture, tied by their thumbs to pulley cords hanging from the ceiling, toes barely touching for up to 30 minutes. This went on until 1905, when the practice was deemed inhumane by a state Senate commission panel. While the size of the hole increased to 4 by 8 by 10 feet when the new prison opened in 1933, it was still a dreadfully dark dungeon, containing just a mattress and 2 buckets, one for fresh water, the other for a toilet. Often used for boxing matches where inmates squared off inside a ring to the cheers and jeers of peers betting on the bout, the gymnasium also housed dozens of inmates when cell blocks of the typically overcrowded compound were filled to capacity. For most of its existence, the gym segregated black and white inmates, each designated to specific areas for exercise, such as weightlifting and basketball games. However, one of the gym's most infamous incidents had nothing to do with recreation. It was rumored that some inmates were hatching a plot to overtake the gym. At the time, plywood covered the once secure but recently broken door in the rear of the room. Suddenly, the makeshift enclosure flew open, sending the plywood board sliding across the floor. Armed men swarmed in, yelling, "Everybody against the wall!" Prisoners quickly lined up. A few confused guards stationed inside the gym joined the line too, until realizing the men with guns were fellow guards rushing in to apprehend the convicts suspected in the takeover scheme. The large field behind the prison at the base of steep mountain cliffs was known as the Yard. Besides offering a scenic view of life beyond the cell block, it was a place to exercise and socialize. Over the years, it served as both a groomed golf course with greens comprised of sand and a baseball park complete with bases, home plate, and a pitcher's mound. Townfolk attended the games between guards and inmates, some of whom could tag a man on third with a 300-foot throw. Though it conveyed a sense of freedom, prisoners like James Earl Ray, who famously jumped the wall at the rear right corner, learned they couldn't outrun both guards and locals who knew the land like the back of their hands. Despite the nice view and a few good games, the Yard would always be at the bottom of a hell they could never escape. The first security checkpoint at Brushy was the large gate and guard station, located 200 yards from Highway 116. The main prison was surveilled by Tower 2, just above the vehicle trapdoor gate entrance, where prisoners first entered the grounds. Once the guard climbed the ladder to their post, they pulled it up behind them to protect their vantage point. Most weapons were checked and stashed in a bucket lifted up to the tower. As it was standard practice for prison employees to remain unarmed, in the event that an inmate overpowered them and seized their weapon. There were also gun towers along the prison perimeter, where guards inside were watching, always ready with a .38 revolver, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a .223 rifle at their side. Built in 1957, D Block was used as isolation cell quarters for the prison's most difficult and deadly criminals. Dubbed the New Hole after the old hole built under the laundry was ostensibly shut down in the 1960s, D Block maximum security residents had more restrictions than inmates living on death row in Nashville. Prisoners were stripped of all privileges and possessions, except their uniforms and bedding. In reality, D Block was not a hole, just a smaller version of blocks A and B, with 4 walks housing 8 single cells on each walk. The blocks had triple locks to prevent access to the other 3 walks. Despite the high security measures, D Block remained a constant site of violence and bloodshed until the new high-security annex building opened on the Hill in 1989. When the 32 solitary cells weren't nearly enough to serve a prison full of first-degree murderers who were as violent on the inside as they had been on the outside, the most serious offenders were sent to a sectioned overflow space in B Block. Life in solitary on B was similar to D, with one exception: a shared exercise cage. The entire prison went on lockdown as B Block's solitary population went out to exercise. Considering these were essentially D Block status inmates, heading out for a few sit-ups was a death wish. Once, an inmate spotting a guy lifting weights pushed the bar onto the man's chest, just as his friend shoved a shank into his side. Prison staff reviewed D Block prisoner profiles monthly to clear them for release back into the general population, but 9 times out of 10, they were denied. Most spent months, if not years, locked in one of these 32 cells, 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour of exercise allowed in a solitary outdoor cage. Inmates could turn off the light bulb in their cell for some shut-eye, but the walk's overhead lighting stayed on 24/7, and sleep was hard to come by. Lenient guards let prisoners hang bed sheets as barriers to help them rest, but mercy was rare in the New Hole. Visitation privileges were only given to well-behaved inmates, subject to the warden's discretion. Prisoners under investigation for any behavioral issues were denied. Model inmates were allowed visitation once a week. Early on, glass partitions prevented physical contact, but when later removed, upwards of 20 inmates sat side by side across from loved ones at tables. Initially, max security offenders were forbidden to have visitation rights, but those with good behavior records were eventually allowed 1-hour non-contact video sessions. Outside the notoriously violent cafeteria, where tensions ran high, including the ever-present racial tension between black and white inmates, who already ate separately, stood an armed guard station. The barrel of a .30-aught rifle, poked through one of the holes drilled into bulletproof glass, sent a warning to inmates that rounds would be fired if things got out of hand. In the event of a riot, the 2 guards aiming those rifles shot to kill. 2 more guards stood watch inside the cafeteria, but unlike their peers, they weren't protected by a pane of flexible glass that could stop a .38 cartridge. Despite toting rifles, they knew to keep their eyes trained on the crowd, especially the table of convicts positioned just outside the gun port, which had been designated for the prison's worst offender. 3 times a day, every cell door opened on an entire block, and guards marched 200 inmates, single file, to the cafeteria. For a time, the surrounding 60-acre working farm, which included livestock, a butcher house, crop fields, and a dairy barn, provided all of the food for the prison. Inmates not only cooked for fellow convicts, but also prison employees. Later, meals made in the main kitchen were also trucked downhill from minimum security and work-release prisoners who lived in barracks outside the wall. Interestingly enough, the same men serving life sentences for killing humans turned out to be animal lovers too. The strong attachments they made with the surrounding wildlife over the years were memorialized in wall paintings created by a few prisoners, doubling as undercover artists. Thinking it would boost morale and improve the cafeteria atmosphere, the warden allowed the men to come help at night after dinner. They initially cleaned walls, then went on to draw sketches, and eventually painted animal portraits and other picturesque scenes of the outside world. A glimpse of the outside world came in the form of mail. All incoming and outgoing correspondence was delivered by the cell block guard, and each parcel was marked with the prisoner's ID number, although new inmates weren't able to receive packages for their first 90 days. Despite this process, more than a few contained contraband. Since every piece was opened and checked, it took ingenuity to conceal nefarious items. A hollowed-out Bible encasing a gun and shoes lined with shanks or drug needles. In later years, X-ray machines and other devices would identify the presence of firearms and cell phones. The latter was used to orchestrate a 2005 escape attempt that left a correctional officer dead. Prisoners could also use these mailboxes to write grievance letters to the warden on everything from prison food to the state of working and living conditions. Known to insiders as the street, the walk wasn't just a passageway, but a potential death trap too. On several brutal occasions, men pushed fellow inmates to their deaths over the railing. In one infamous incident, a Memphis gang member turned inmate met his fate up on 3 Walk when 2 men grabbed him from behind and stabbed him in the neck. When he was quickly tossed over the rail, he landed on 2 guards standing below. It was suspected the violent act was meant to send an intimidating message not only to fellow prisoners, but prison staff too. Afterward, floor-to-ceiling cage walls were erected to help prevent such horrific events from happening again. After the mines closed in the late 1960s, Brushy had a bit of a facelift. New programs and services aiming to reduce violence and facilitate better transitions from prison life into the outside world for medium-security inmates were introduced. The majority of inmates were now serving shorter sentences for lesser crimes. Brushy increasingly became a designation point for detainees rather than a maximum security state pen. Courses such as the Positive Mental Attitude Program were introduced in 1978, designed to help inmates build their strengths versus correct their weaknesses. And in 1980, the Regional Rehabilitation Community was established, which provided a post office, gym, library, infirmary, classrooms, and sleeping quarters. The initiative created 205 new jobs for the community. The most critical component of prison security, the count, took place 3 times a day, when guards walked along cells accounting for every inmate. Each cell was locked by a key and a drawbar, controlled by the cell block officer. Officers were constantly finding contraband in cells, including shanks cut from metal bed frames with the help of guitar strings or jewelry chains. Despite surprise raids conducted at 3 a.m. to confiscate illegal drugs and weapons, officers never seemed to make a dent in the prisoners' illicit inventory. There was always an inmate on watch to warn the block that a raid was underway, and somehow even 10-inch long knives and .22 caliber zip guns survived the search. In truth, Brushy was so dangerous, most convicts felt compelled to keep weapons just to stay alive. Arguably its most infamous inmate, Martin Luther King Jr.'s convicted assassin, James Earl Ray, spent years locked up in Brushy, notably spending time inside cell number 28. After initially pleading guilty to the Martin Luther King Jr. shooting, he later recanted, claiming to be the patsy of a government conspiracy. Despite several escape attempts, one of which led to a massive FBI hunt in 1977, earning him dreaded D-block isolation and years added to his sentence. He was reportedly an otherwise model prisoner. Once stabbed 22 times by 4 black inmates, he managed to survive. While suffering from liver disease in a Nashville correctional hospital, Ray promised Dr. King's son he was innocent shortly before he died in April of 1998. No evidence ever emerged to prove his claim. Beginning back in 1896, the barren field known as Simmons Hill Cemetery became the final resting place for those who died behind the wall and were never claimed by a loved one. Just a half-mile from the prison walls lay countless inmates whose lost identities remain a mystery. Small stones initially marked graves, but as time has gone on, the stones have been displaced or destroyed. The last few remaining stones have been gathered together as a memorial to the nameless.